Okay, I'm Erin Somerville at McCallum High School going over foreign policy. I have for you that you should print up or look at an outline of my lecture. So there's no PowerPoint for this one, but I will show some links and stuff as we go through this. So the first topic is the question about democracy and foreign policy. Basically, I'm going to make the statement that democracy and foreign policy don't jive. And that's going to be a concern because we are a democracy. We're a democratic republic, and national security is really of the utmost importance for all Americans. It is majoritarian politics. It is something that is important to everybody, that everybody pays for. So, maybe pause this and think about why democracy and foreign policy don't jive. So when I say foreign policy, that's a really broad array of smaller policies. So it's got lots of facets. I'm going to be talking right now about national security. So when we think about democracy and national security being the utmost important foreign policies, those just can come into conflict quite quickly. And why might that be? The first is that national security requires a good deal of secrecy. For example, no Americans, the general public, did not know when Obama was going to be killing Osama bin Laden. Didn't know where Osama bin Laden was, didn't know who we were sending in, when, or even where in the world this could be. And the United States went through Pakistan, also not informing Pakistan that we would be in their territory conducting this mission to kill Osama bin Laden. Why didn't we know about it? Well, this was a matter of national security. Had Obama come out and said, hey, tomorrow, 10 a.m., our time, 2 in the morning their time, whatever it was, we're going to get Osama bin Laden, well, that might have foiled the plans. So, national security often requires that not everyone has access to information. But democracy, a functioning democracy, requires that the electorate, who participate in the decision-making, that they're fully informed. So how can we ask our citizenry to participate in national security matters and make solid decision-making when they're not going to be shown all the information? So that's going to be a contradiction that cannot be avoided. The next conflict has to do with the fact that democracy means that people are informed and participating in the decision-making process. And so that can be our congressmen, 535 people in the House of Representatives and Senate, participating in the decision-making process, or it could also be describing Americans participating in decision-making. Well, when it comes to dealing with a crisis and a national security issue, time is usually of the essence. So national security often involves and needs swift decision-making. Well, democracy is not very swift. So whether it's the citizenry making up their mind and participating through elections, or it is 535 people in Congress debating, we're not going to get quick action through democracy. Democracy is deliberative, and it can be very well thought out. Very good policy can come out of the democratic form of government, but not in a crisis, not in an emergency. So that's two ways so far that democracy and national security don't jive. And a third way is when we think about national security, or any security for that matter, we generally have to balance security and freedom, or security and liberty, freedom versus order. That's the original dilemma that we have been faced with in this American experiment, and it's a dilemma that every country, every government deals with. You do want enough freedom for your citizenry, but you also need to maintain order and safety. And so we expect our government to provide that order, and in providing that order, we often have to give up some freedoms. when we see the word democracy, it encompasses so much more than just the right to vote. When we see democracy, what we also mean is freedom, freedom and democracy. So often national security is going to involve a restriction of freedom, and that itself can feel undemocratic. Okay, the next topic, the constitutional struggle between the president and Congress. We've seen this before when we examined the War Powers Resolution, but I'm going to put this slide back up here for us to see. So here what you have in front of you, this constitutional struggle, shows how Congress has some clear war powers, war and peace powers. Congress has the power to declare war. Congress has power of the purse to fund any military engagement and to raise our army. And Congress also gets to regulate commerce with other countries, and within this country, of course. The president, on the other hand, has his list of powers, but these two are not completely separate spheres. You can see how they can come into conflict. They could arguably be two sides working together, but they could be two sides working sort of against one another. The president is commander-in-chief, which means he can make war. He can direct troops. Well, that can be confusing if Congress has the power to declare war and power to raise funds for the military. The president can negotiate a treaty, needs Senate approval. So some of it looks like the framers set it up so that the two would check in with one another when it comes to war powers, that we'd have this nice balance and a system of checks and balances. But it does get confusing when the president wages war without a declaration of war. I want to add in some vocabulary, since you guys have looked at these powers before. The executive agreement. An executive agreement is when a president negotiates a deal with another power, with another country, and doesn't get Senate approval. Doesn't even send it to the Senate for Senate approval. Says it's okay that this is not a treaty. It'll just be an agreement, an executive agreement, that is. The executive agreement can pretty much have the same effect as a treaty. What it doesn't do is have the long-term legal standing. So what I mean is when it's a treaty, that means it has force of law, and future presidents will have to abide by the treaty. When the president enters into an executive agreement, that agreement is as good as his word, which he can only keep while he's in power. So the next president, in theory, could, dismantle a previous executive agreement. Presidents are not going to be eager to do that. Generally, a president will do their best to maintain executive agreements. And this is because it's a matter of our integrity and our reliability in the international community. So if one president negotiates a deal, the next president comes in and undermines that, we as a country are not reliable. So presidents will generally try to maintain the previous president's executive agreement, or executive order for that matter, but it doesn't have the same force of law. It is not safe from the next president and potentially the next Congress. Okay, so that's the constitutional struggle. I want to talk about the instruments in foreign policy. You got three instruments, three tools in your tool belt. So, the military tool, the threat of war, war itself or the threat of war, that's your last resort. So in your notes I have it as the third option. This is the sort of tool you pull out in your tool belt because it's really come down to this and you've exhausted all other ways. But when we think about tools in our tool belt, I'm saying you have three tools, and you use these tools to get other countries, other global actors to behave in a certain way. So the first tool in our tool belt that we pull out, we use quite frequently, even when we're not trying to change another country's behavior, even when it's not a concern of immediate security, and that is diplomacy. Diplomacy has to do with our relationship with other countries, that we want to maintain a positive relationship so that when something does happen, we know who our allies are, we can rely on our allies. So that means that we have to prove ourselves trustworthy and reliable to them. Diplomacy comes in a whole bunch of forms. We rely on a number of bureaucratic agencies. The most prominent would be the State Department to maintain our relationship with other countries. So the way we do this is through, some trade agreements, our openness between our borders. So for, our visa application, so if we have a good relationship with a country and someone from that country wants to visit ours, we make the visa application easier to acquire. But if we have, not a great relationship, then the visa application will be much, much more difficult. So our immigration policies and our border policies can be a reflection of our diplomacy. The Ebola crisis that broke out now a couple years ago, when that hit, it's a domestic crisis. We don't want Ebola in this country, but it's also a global crisis, and that's when we call up our allies. And it's a good thing we've maintained those allies through diplomacy. So Obama called up about 10 different world leaders, I think it was maybe 5 from Europe and 5 from Africa, got on the phone to say, what can we do as a group? How can we be collaboratively working together, helpful on this crisis? And that helps preserve security now with the Ebola crisis, but then it helps us later to maintain security because we have these good relationships with other countries. Your economic tool in your tool belt. This is the second tool to pull out. But I want to make sure we know that it is quite an escalation. So that's the point I'm going to be trying to illustrate. And today, those would be economic sanctions. So in the past, we might have had embargoes, and we still have those to some extent. But an economic sanction, that's a broad term for a variety of things that you can do economically to essentially strangle a country. And that is your goal with economic sanctions. It is to keep goods that they need out, and it is to sort of cripple their economy. Now, that sort of policy is going to affect the people of the country. So not necessarily the military or the government directly, but by affecting the people, there will be pressure put on the government, that the people themselves, because of the economic calamities of economic sanctions, will then pressure their own regime to cooperate. So economic sanctions, those would be cutting trade, cutting resources from that country, and we would do it, but we also want to get all of our allies. So remember those diplomatic ties that we have with other countries, we're going to call them and say, join with us in keeping these materials out of that country. And another part of it will be freezing their assets. So in this global interdependent economy, in this world, money is generally not sitting under your mattress in your bed at home, but rather it can be overseas in other banks. And so with economic sanctions, what our government will do is it will freeze assets, other people's assets, so that they cannot get their assets. So if somebody in another country has their money in a Swiss bank, that's a bad example, but has their money somewhere else, we can potentially freeze that account so that they don't have access to their own money. And that's going to pull money out of their economy, and that can lead to inflation. Then after economic sanctions, you got your military, your war, your threat of war. A lot of that doesn't need too much explaining. That is your last resort. That's going to be boots on the ground or air raids, but the idea is it's going to use weapons. One of the big differences here, though, is when we finally get to that point, we should be targeting military combatants. We should be targeting not civilians. Economic sanctions, however, do target civilians, or their effect is directly felt by civilians before reaching our real goal. Okay, so I have something I want to show you, so pause this, and then there's a clip. Pause this, or not pause it, stop it and go to the next one.